Hey everyone, so today I want to talk about MIDI, and this is going to be the first in a series. Today specifically I'm going to be covering the MIDI settings in a little bit more depth, and then how I use it with my keyboard and a couple different ways that you could set that up, specifically using this keyboard to control the OPZ. So the easiest and I think best way to access the MIDI settings is to press the two index buttons on the side there. So that's screen and metronome. So the two, when you're looking at it, they're on the right. If you press those down, you'll notice that maybe these light up, maybe you see some numbers here, and those are all the MIDI settings. You can change it from the app or from the computer, but I'll talk about those later. So let's open up our MIDI settings, and each track that's lit up means that the OPZ is going to be sending MIDI data from that track to an external source, as long as the track's not muted. And that's another similar topic. So that's the basic. If I want the kick track to be sending out MIDI data, I would turn it on or turn it off. And a big reason why I'm not doing the overhead video right now is because I really want to emphasize like being able to not be totally focused on the OPZ, and I thought it might be easier to show some of the actual connections from this angle. So hopefully I'll actually help you memorize it. So like I said, you press down the metronome and the screen buttons, and you can see the tracks are lit up for every single MIDI track that is sending MIDI out. So if you want to change the outgoing track, make sure the track is lit up. So right now this is the chords one. I know you can't see on the camera, but I will be getting a new camera soon though. If I hold down the chords track now, it's going to start flashing. And right now, you can't really tell the difference. It's flashing because it's saying it's outgoing on channel 8, but the chords track is already on the 8th spot here. So if I use this right wheel, I can change which MIDI track is outgoing from here. So you can see that the chords track is highlighted, and then the track of the outgoing MIDI is flashing. So in this case, that would be track 11. And I could just move these back and forth, and then from this point, if I press any of these other tracks, it'll show me which MIDI track is outgoing for that. Okay, so the one weird thing that I don't fully understand is that the MIDI in for the OPZ, you can't adjust that. And I swear when I first got mine, it was adjusting that, and then I updated the firmware and it didn't, but I also might have just not been like testing it right. So that's probably the most important part. The next is going to be your settings, and you can change these on the fly pretty easily. They're organized in a way that I think makes some sense. So if I hold down our shortcut here of, again, metronome and screen, the MIDI options are 1 through 8. So this is all of them on. 9 and 10 or 9 and 0 don't do anything. But those are all of your MIDI options. And the way that they're organized is these first 3 are about MIDI note data. So the first one is whether or not when this receives something to channel 1, those notes, that MIDI information goes to whatever the active track is here. So if I'm on the kick track, that means that if MIDI is enabled for the kick track, and I'm sending MIDI to channel 1, it's going to go to the kick track. And then if I switch to the motion track, it's going to send it to the motion track. 2 and 3 have to do with MIDI in and MIDI out. Does the OPZ accept MIDI in? Does it transmit MIDI out? So these 3 are about MIDI. Channel 1 goes to the active track, MIDI in, MIDI out. Clock in, clock out are the next 2. And the nice thing about this is that it's kind of arranged that, these are adjacent to each other and have this space because of the because there's no sharp or flat here. And these 2 clock in, clock out. So channel 1, in, out, in, out. These next 3 are supposed to be about how the OPZ interacts with other gear. I don't know enough about program change to really talk about that. I haven't played with it much. I don't use it much. I'm pretty new to a lot of this. So I'll be exploring that later on my own. We'll see if I make a video or not. But 7 is supposed to echo MIDI back. So meaning that if you send something to the OPZ, will the OPZ then repeat that MIDI information to anything else that's connected via MIDI to the OPZ? So that's what MIDI echo is supposed to do. Weirdly enough, between me and another user on the Electronauts board, we figured out that 1 always enables 7. So 1 always enables MIDI echo. If it's off, MIDI echo's off and channel 1 to active track are off. If it's on, MIDI echo is on and channel 1 to active track is on. So that's a little bit confusing, but I believe that 8 is enabling program change and 6 is enabling like an alternate interpretation. Again, I don't know a ton about that. So I just focus on 1 through 5. And with these memorized, I can do most anything. Typically, I don't keep the clock on because if you have both of them on, I've just had a couple times where it's created a weird loop or I've forgotten which one is on or isn't on. So I just prefer to turn that on and off depending on what I'm connected to. I almost always have 1 on because that's how I use my keyboard, which is what we're going to get to next, as long as I go ahead here and check my notes. I was going to also say that unless I'm mistaken, I don't really use MIDI in to control the drums on the OPZ. But unless I'm mistaken, anything that goes to track 1, if the kick track has MIDI enabled, anything that goes to channel 1 will go to the kick track. But then if you have channel 1 to active track, I don't know if that cancels out. Maybe I'll actually test that in a second, but I suspect that it doesn't and it just plays both. We'll see. Last thing I was going to say. So this pressing a track here is going to enable or disable both MIDI in and MIDI out for that track. Something interesting that you might want to be aware of if you're working with external gear is that if you hold down the mixer button, so that's this index button here, if you hold down the mixer button, all the white tracks are the ones that are enabled. If you hold shift, I'm very often lately, as I've been messing with this, I'm holding down, I'm pressing shift and then I'm selecting tracks, what would that be, 5 through 8. So the bass, lead, arp, and chords track. Because I'm not using the internal engines of the OPZ, I'm sending that to external synths, which I'll also be talking about in another video. So one downside is that you will still get audio if there's a send from any of these to the line out, if you have the line module, or to an effects track, or to the tape track. Even if these are muted in this way, even if like the bass track is muted in this way, it's still going to send that audio to that send. So you want to make sure that those effect sends are down on those tracks if you don't want that audio to kind of leak in. So I was going to say, let's talk about the different ways that you can change this. And maybe this first video is only going to actually cover MIDI settings. So the first way, so I mentioned this shortcut here is my favorite with the metronome and the screen buttons. You can control all the MIDI settings from here, except you can't change the CC, which I think is continuous control or control change. I don't know. I don't use them very much and I don't map them to anything. So unfortunately, I can't say a ton about it. But you can't adjust which channels that transmits from or receives. You can only do that on the app or on the computer. I don't love the app. I always have intended to use the OPZ without it, so I only really pull up the app when I can't remember what something is or when I'm really trying to understand something, or for sampling, which, another topic. So I think that it's better to just change it on the computer, because here's how fast it is. So I turn off the OPZ, I turn it on while pressing screen. Once this turns green, screen is for firmware updates. I turn it on while holding track. That's it. So I turn it on holding track, and once these are all green, now if I just connect this to my laptop, it's going to immediately, in my experience, basically immediately pop up with the files, and then you can just swap MIDI files out, or you can MIDI config files out, or you can very quickly change the MIDI config file. I think it's just in the config folder. And then once that's done, you just eject the drive. It turns blue, then it boots back up. So I find that to be very fast, and I find the app to be incredibly irritating, because the only way I think that you can change the CC in and out is by selecting it and then using that kind of up and down little side part of the app to change the value. So it's not as precise as I would like it to be. Okay. Boy. Well, I guess I'm just going to stick with having this be thorough instead of covering more ground. So I'm going to split this up again, and I will see you in the next video where I'll cover actually using keyboard into the OPC.